story about a person falling in love with a car. So can you tell more about maybe what do you think about this app being one of the devices that promote a certain view? And do you think this is a minor app that doesn't have any real effect? And another maybe remark, not question. When I talked to the guy who does the AI for the app, he said that they got recently a call from a person who wanted to kill themselves. And they said, yeah, the app was what made me not to kill myself. So basically these kinds of companion apps are used as 40 pounds therapy solution. And it's not a solution, but like it obviously, they said we have a role in preventing somebody's suicide. And because of the specific demographic of people using this stuff that are usually not having a lot of interaction with other beings in face-to-face, not screen-to-screen conversation. So I just think another issue that maybe it would make sense to open is just about what are the stories that it's not only about the gender in a way. And I just think, sometimes I think to myself, should we even talk about this? Should we change the narrative, or what should we do about it? But I also like when you said what is this RSA graduate thing that you like. It's again, basically you said that it makes you learn about yourself. It's again not a solution that would encourage interaction with other people. And I'm a bit skeptical whether sex technologies are something that promote eroticism versus in relation or pornography. I think it's more it's difficult to escape the trap of pornography. And I guess maybe because I see perhaps these devices as something that is designed by males predominantly. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure that was but the question would be for the erotic storytelling, if you can say more about it.
Yeah, sure. So when you interact with Harmony in the app, you can request for her to tell you a story. All of the stories that I experienced in my interactions with her are all very much linked into having sex with a piece of technology. So one of them was a man that had sex with a car seat. Another one was to do with a sort of robotic sex maid that I think played pretty hard to get for a while and then eventually gave in. And I think it really is to match the demographic of this app, which is currently really small. I'm not sure exactly as to how many users it has exactly, but obviously to invest in this piece of technology to this manifestation that you want this kind of companion, technological companion, those stories do really sort of match and validate, I guess, their own experience and what they're wanting within it. In regards to what you said about the guy who was obviously not in a good place and found an actual companion with this piece of technology, I think that is a trend that we're seeing more and more. There's a lot to do with, particularly in Japan, to do with how we can use robots to look after, say, old people. But I do genuinely believe that I don't think a robot is a substitute for a person. And I think, like, obviously, it's good to hear that somebody did find companionship and harmony, but we need to be very tricky as a society in terms of promoting sort of technological alternatives to actual human connections. Particularly, I guess, going back to the case of old people, the robot seal Paro, I don't know how many people have encountered that, but it's basically designed to be given to older, lonely people as a companion. Whereas I think probably we should be investing more into how other people can be spending more time with those people rather than creating a technological alternative. In regards to the sort of sex tech wearables, the Wisp ones, at the moment they're mainly they're designed for women, really. And from speaking with the designer, the idea was really as a way of that, in their research anyway, that women found that they were far more aroused by an entire bodily experience rather than just the act of sex. And the wearables themselves were sort of designed to sort of just give them an intermittent sort of reminder that they are embodied, and that their pleasure can be linked to any number of things, including whether that's a smell or just like a small touch, such as on the neckline, because that's where the necklace sits. And I don't think, whilst I think the wearables are really interesting, but I think the main message of what I want to take away from, at least in my research, is that whilst all these technologies can be really exciting and can offer an enhancement of sexual pleasure or new ways for us to explore that, is that technology should never actually be used as a full alternative to a sexual relationship or with a human being, really just a form of enhancement or sort of further exploration. I hope that answers kind of what you were asking.
First of all, thank you both. It was really, really interesting. And I have a question for you, Eleanor. I missed the first few minutes, so I don't know if you talked about it. But what about the data collection?
Yeah, so I think the data collection can be really problematic, and I think with sex technology even now, I mean, I think there's a weird thing that people can be like, oh, I don't even think about the data necessarily being collected when they're using their phone. But as soon as somebody said to you like, oh, by the way, your vibrator is collecting your data and we know what setting you like it to be on, then people get really suddenly very defensive and freak out. And I think from all of the sex toy or sex tech designers I have met, for them it therefore becomes more of a consideration than, say, with other technologies. In regards to the Harmony app, I think in terms of that's how that data is being managed, I know that obviously they have a very small demographic of users, so in terms of the AI's development, it's really restricted in the fact that it's got a very small user group of only men that want it to basically just talk dirty to it. Yeah. So in terms of that how that data is managed, in the end user agreement, I'm pretty sure it says something along the lines of that they're allowed to store your interactions alongside your personal details. But then I have also read that the interactions are encrypted and that supposedly they don't look at it. So it's not widely reported anyway for me to be able to dig deep down into that data set. But ultimately, any AI that's being created that has a non-inclusive and very biased set of people creating the data is always going to be skewed. So it's not going to ever sort of... I mean, and the fact as well that robotics is very defensive in saying that it's going to be creating a male sex robot for female users or gay male users, but the AI app, as far as I know at the moment, it's only a female avatar that you can speak to. So if they do try and roll it out so that it's a male sort of avatar that you're interacting with, the data set isn't going to be there to support it because the only people that have used it up to then will have been straight men.
Še kako vprašanje? Lahko tudi v slovenščini, pa magari prevedemo. Any questions, comments? Kathleen Richardson made a very good point the other day that our cultural imagination is always kind of steps ahead, sometimes even way ahead of technological advancements. But the cultural imagination always gets somehow turned sour in a way. So I'm going to throw in as we're going to watch it later on today, the Ex Machina movie. Can we envision, all of this data collection and deep learning merge into an AI, an anthropomorphic AI that is emphatic, that communicates well, is a good listener, but also, reads our desires better than we read ours, via all of that. Can we already now project a certain situation where we can ask ourselves, at what point does a robot or an AI, anthropomorphic AI, consent?
Yeah, it's
Or where do we consent to such a entity?
Yeah, I think the notion of sexual consent tied up in the sex robot is really tricky. I think whilst the whole sort of sci-fi, like in Ex Machina, it's obviously sort of what we all hold in mind. Definitely in my research, I really want to get down to what the practicalities are, which is why I like to speak about things like the actual materials, because I think we need to get away from what this vision supposedly is that sci-fi has taught us and actually acknowledge what this technology is now. And whilst I'm sure maybe in the future with all of this data and as technology advances more and more, there may be a time when there is a robot that is it Ava in Ex Machina? Maybe, that's like that, which is when consent is going to be a real issue if we're thinking that the robot itself is autonomous. But at the moment, I don't think it's so much as an issue. I think the building of some kind of sexual consent design feature into sex robot is really problematic for me. And I don't really condone for a sex robot to take humanoid form anyway. And I do think that even if a sex robot is meant to be saying no, or I think that there's a paper written that suggests it could have like a locking vagina feature, that means that basically unless if the robots express consent, it won't open anyway. I think that's really just going to condone for people to act out violent sexual fantasies on it instead anyway. So I think there may be a solution in the future to that, but currently I feel the actual capability of the sex robot is really low. And whilst it is problematic, I think in terms of the manifestation that we're thinking about in sci-fi is so far away, also that whilst it's good to be having this conversation now and thinking about how we might regulate that, we've got time, I guess, would be my response to that.
Okay. Zadnja prilika. Okay, in that case, thank you, Anna Bodvan.
Okay.
Hvala, Renata Šribar. To so bili spolni roboti od podaljškov do samostojnih entitet. Up next, data harvesting capabilities of Android apps, period trackers, možnosti podatkovnega zbiranja Android aplikacij, spremljanje menstrualnega cikla. Že čez nekaj minut. Hvala. Tako, rečeno, storjeno, obljuba dolg. As promised, data harvesting capabilities of Android apps, period trackers, z možnosti podatkovnega zbiranja Android aplikacij, spremljanje menstrualnega cikla. Contributors.
Thank you.
Kamila Koronska is an MA student of Big Data in Culture and Society at King's College London and a Polish journalist. She works for the National Polish Television as a researcher and as a TV news editor for a smaller, less politically influenced news program. Even more politically influenced.
That's very important.
Yeah, political thrust it is. She's based in London, where she works in a digital marketing agency, has a keen interest in the influence of technology on societies, especially the way information and knowledge are shared. Sharing is caring. Yeah. Katja Čičigoj je filozofinja, ki zaključuje doktorski študij z disertacijo iz feministične filozofije na Univerzi Justus Liebig v Gießenu. Bila je gostujoča raziskovalka na Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy, Kingston University London, ter na Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought, Goldsmiths College, prav tako LND London. Zanima se za moderno in sodobno evropsko filozofijo, politično filozofijo, kritično teorijo, filozofijo tehnologije in filozofijo spola. Je soustanoviteljica feministične bralne skupine Delfinke in članica društva Mesto žensk. Prosim, please.
Hi, hello. My name is Camilla and I'm today going to present you and walk you through one of my papers that I wrote for King's College London. And I'm both thrilled and terrified to be here because this is the first time I presented to someone and it's also the first time I'm going to present any kind of a paper to a bigger audience, so please be patient with me. But okay, so before I start actually talking about the data harvesting capabilities of Android apps, I would like to tell you a bit of a background how I got interested into the whole thing. So as I was doing one of my research for big data in practice, I came across a story about this Princeton University professor called Janet Vertesi, who managed to successfully hide from marketers and advertiser firms the fact that she was pregnant. And as you can imagine, that came with a lot of sacrifices and a lot of efforts. Because, well, as you know, probably, data of a pregnant woman is at least twice as valuable for the marketers, and that's because when you are at the life-changing event, such as when you are pregnant, you probably at the beginning, you are at the moment when you'll be probably making very important decisions that would influence your long-term consumption patterns. So, for example, choosing between Huggies or Pampers diapers is a very important decision that, of course, that's a very important decision for marketers, and it's something that they would like to know about you. So Janet Vertesi project, as you can imagine, came with a lot of sacrifices and efforts, as I said. So she, for example, withstood from mentioning her pregnancy on social media and asked her friends to do the same. From the very beginning, she was only using cash to pay for anything that was pregnancy related, and that included pregnancy tests. She created a decoy Amazon account using a private server that would send the deliveries to a local locker. And she also used a Tor browser to perform untrackable and untraceable browsing. So I thought that if web works so well for predicting if a woman is pregnant, how about applications that probably are as good or twice as good in collecting reams of behavioral data? But of course, not all applications are malicious and not all applications are bad, and at least not as bad as those with intrusive profiling enabled with them. So I was interested in how you make a decision, how you go about it, and how you decide that application is bad. So that was the first step, how I was thinking of choosing my sample. And as I was working as a journalist, I would always be reminded that if you want to have a good overview of a story, or if you want to really know the interactions between the parties, the best way to do it is just to follow the money and ask yourself a very simple questions, like where did the funds come from? What can the profile of a sponsor company tell us about the activities of the company they funding? Was it a debt or was it a barter exchange? So on and so forth. And because an app is a product, like any other product or service on a digital market, in a digital market, is regulated by the rules of digital economy. The app providers are companies, oftentimes startup companies that are ready to move fast and break things, but nevertheless they're still companies that need to generate a stable profit to remain healthy business entities. And to generate a revenue and keep the cash flowing, they need to come up with a business plan that will essentially let them to depict the value proposition, creation, and capturing. Business model helps the founders, the CEOs, the investors to see how the idea for the business can be taken further and how it will aggregate revenue to the future. Sorry, I forgot to flip my slides. Okay, so as I said to you before, that was about what makes bad applications bad. And now let's get back to this slide. So since the same technology, commercialized in a different way, would yield different revenue results, app publishers face a problem how to best commercialize their technology to survive in a highly competitive digital market. When I was looking at the applications, I saw that mostly the people who design period trackers, they would favor two types of business models. So a freemium model and a multi-sided business model. Okay, a freemium model essentially comes into play. Sorry, an app that is operating on a freemium model has one objective to achieve, and that is to create a profitable customer base of regular users who could use certain features of the service for free, while a premium content, extra features would be charged for. So a key assumption is that the so-called free riders would always be there, and because they have a high ad tolerance, they would likely proceed using the basic features of the app. But at the same time, there will be a significant number of users that by getting attached to the product, or rather hooked with it, will be willing to make in-app purchases as probably also paying a subscription fee. And this is something that is called a locked-in experience, that on the surface might look like a byproduct of an excellent and useful service on its own, for example, music streaming. But as much as this is true for some of the digital products, it's not true for all of them, which means that companies need to come up with ideas how they could embed a successful engagement strategy to make the products addictive and indispensable, or at least so they could make them feel like they're indispensable. On the other hand, there is also a multi-sided business model, and I think you're all familiar with it because this is actually the one that Facebook operates on. And the multi-sided business model is sometimes also called the Internet's original sin. And it's because it preys on what Internet used to be, or rather how it was envisioned by its founders, so as a free and democratic medium. The multi-sided business model comes into play when a party has a considerable interest that another party has been enabled as subsidized or easiest access to the service. And of course, this is not always the case, and it doesn't have to always have bad implications. So for example, we can imagine how that could work in e-health. A hospital might have an interest in having a centralized electronic medical report system that would store patients' medical history, diagnostics, findings in one place and free of charge. And that is because for hospital that could be an incentive in paying for the system because it allows it to streamline the process of attending the patient next time he or she walks through the doors to seek help. However, this is not always so true with free applications, and that's because, with free mobile health applications. And that is because most providers find it really hard to find, or actually fail, to find a long-term subsidizers that at least by some proximity could have a business incentive that is related to the product they're trying to commercialize. And that, of course, creates a tension to generate a steady cash flow. And this becomes more important than the value product for the user itself, and is also a very moment when the incentives of a subsidizer are being prioritized over the good of a user. If app publishers fail to secure a source of funding from a preferred subsidizer, and when it comes to period application trackers, that could be, for example, a clinical academic research, in order to survive beyond the initial point of launching the app, they would probably look for other funding from other parties, such as business affiliates. And up to this day, the most powerful and notorious players in the multi-sided market are still marketers and advertisers. A significant base of regular customers is here also created for the profile. However, rather than in a freemium model where the customer base is important to induce this kind of a lock-in syndrome, here would simply be used as a source of insights in a form of advertising profiles, a contact databases, or simply a raw data to fill the gaps in the marketing reports. This relationship is very similar to the one that data brokers establish with other companies, and creates a situation in which developers merely act as matchmakers between the data supply and the market that needs this type of health data. But of course, after looking at the business model, there came a time when I also had to consider what makes a bad technology. And I'm sure it won't be revelation to anyone that app coded with any of the best intentions won't work well on a vulnerable operating system. Between the two dominant mobile systems at the moment, Android and iOS, the unprecedented winner when it comes to the user's security for a long time has been Apple. And that is because it values user-friendly interfaces, it tends to reject apps of not lasting value, so if developers don't offer much functionality or content, the app could not be approved by iOS, and it also recently restricted the way developers can use information about iPhone owners. On that note, Android's product emerged as less secure, and that was basically a decision why I decided to go and analyze the Android applications rather than the products of iOS. So as I was proceeding with my research, it became apparent that there are certain characteristics that are typical for the tracking apps, and that is poor functionality or content that doesn't secure a lasting value, exposure to vulnerable data, vulnerable mobile operating system, as well as inadequate business model design. These features and the story of the Janet Vertesi helped me to discover the topic and also pushed me into thinking about period calendars as being the object of this investigation. And as I had my sample ready, I started to analyze it to see if I could find a tracking ecosystem that could be probably as powerful as the one of the web. So that was essentially my sample, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with some of the products because these applications tend to have over 10 million downloads. And all of them are, of course, as I said, Android products. And as I have explained, they also tend to have all the characteristics of the bad application. And it is because, in essence, they can't offer any type of a long-lasting value. And if you think of it, in the end, they're just the calendars that every woman already has as an inbuilt feature on their phones. Secondly, they have an exposure to extremely valuable and vulnerable data, the one that can accurately predict if a woman is pregnant, for example, or is planning to conceive. Third, they are built on vulnerable operating system, and none of them, although having something to do with medical data, are operating on e-commerce business model design. And that choice, of course, is largely inadequate, and it represents a significant lack in business thinking when it comes to ways how value can be captured with such technology and commercialized on the market without the need to violate users' privacy. A type of data that I was using for the research is sometimes referred to as hackable data, and it is so because, unlike the public information or open source data, it is enclosed and sits in proprietary black boxes that belongs to the companies that create them. And it can only be accessed by those who know how to break into materiality of digital media, and unfortunately, this is not most of us. In order to do this, I conducted what in theory was a static analysis, and I'm saying in theory because there was only a short project, so I wasn't able to look at the entire code. Static analysis is often used to uncover security and privacy issues of mobile software. The analysis involves, unlike the dynamic analysis that looks at the network, looking at the Android code without actually running or executing it. With the use of automated tool that was provided to me and my colleagues through King's College, I was able to subtract the code, look at this and compare if there are any discrepancies between the code and the terms and conditions that could possibly be omitted in the Google Play Store. One of the first things I've done was to look into a file that is called Android manifest, and as any type of a manifest, it's just a declaration of what could possibly happen into the future. And here the future is, let's say, presented with permissions. The permissions belong to the permissions are created or belong to the Android communication mechanism that is there to inform a user that certain repositories of mobile sensors, such as GPS or camera, might be used by the app. And it's there in order to protect the user from the data breach or data leak. And in order to use any Android apps, any user will have to agree upon installation and accept all of the permissions. The only exception are the dangerous permissions that after an update are granted on a runtime permission basis. And I'm sure if any of you ever used Android, you're probably familiar with it. It's just essentially a cautionary information box that pops up whenever the application is accessing one of the sensor or sensitive repositories on your device. However, the model is itself far from perfect, but I will explain to you it a little bit later. So what type of permissions I saw when I opened the Android manifest? I'm going to talk only about the dangerous permissions because, of course, they're the most interesting ones here. And in my sample, I was able to see 90% of the apps that ask to write data on external storage. And external storage is not a storage on some other planet. It's just basically, misleadingly, still on your phone. It's your SD card. And although we can read, for example, in Android developer manual that developers shouldn't be using this type of permission for files with access restrictions, and nevertheless, although these applications would ask such a permission, the data that is stored on external storage, unlike data saved internally, is considered to be word readable and could be revealed if not protected properly. And that entails that the sensitive information will be stored there. Anyone with the knowledge to bypass the security could be able to read it, and especially if that's not encrypted. The permissions are often asked because the app needs more storage space. Most of the time, it is because these applications, as I said to you, they don't provide really that much of functionality. They are just calendars, so they need all the extra fluff to generate user engagement.